Well, welcome to our Bible study for tonight. I'm glad you're joining us, whether you're live or watching the recording. We're glad you're here. So I'm going to begin with prayer, and tonight's prayer is the lyrics to the hymn "Speak, O Lord" by Keith Getty. So let's pray. Speak, O Lord, as we come to you to receive the food of your holy word. Take your truth, plant it deep within us, shape and fashion us into your likeness, that by grace we'll stand on your promises and by faith we'll walk as you walk with us. Speak, O Lord, till your church is built and the earth is filled with your glory. And all God's people said,
Amen.
Amen. So tonight we are on day 7. This is the book we are using. If you don't know, we're on day 7 on page 29. And we were talking a little bit before the recording started is how timely this is. We can talk about that. So it begins with this passage from Matthew 8. It says, "And behold, a leper came and worshiped Jesus, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.'" And then Lucado just kind of emotionally retells this story in his own words. He says, for 5 years, no one touched me. They would look at him, they would talk to him, but they weren't willing to touch him. And then on page 30, he talks about how leprosy was one of the most dreaded diseases within the Bible. It rendered the body a mass of ulcers and decay. Fingers would curl and gnarl. Blotches of skin would discolor and stink. And then they would be, ostracized into these leper colonies, thinking it was very contagious. The sad truth is we now know that it's not very contagious. It is contagious, but you have to be around someone for a very long time and have much contact with them in order to catch the leprosy. So, and then he talks about, how you start losing feeling in your extremities and, with the nerve damage. He talks about, nicking his finger and almost bleeding freely. And then, that he has to go and show himself to the priest because the priest would be the one that would either say that you were clean or unclean. And of course, he was labeled unclean. And then finally on page 32, he says, "What I saw in their eyes was a precursor to what I've seen in every eye since, fearful pity. As I stepped out, they stepped back. Their horror of my disease was greater than their concern for my heart. So they and everyone else I have seen since stepped back." So this whole reading is talking about being quarantined. And, we've all lived through a quarantine now. We were talking earlier, if we would have done this study 6 months ago, I think it would have been too raw and we wouldn't have been able to process it as much. But I think now that we are on the tail end of the quarantine, a lot of us have had some time to think about what we went through and what we learned and that kind of thing. So I just want to ask, what was the quarantine like in your life, and maybe what was the worst parts of being quarantined during the coronavirus? Let's start there.
Putting up with Peg.
Oh,
Wow.
Do you, yes. So yes, Carol.
Well, we had some good points, but the worst part was not being able to touch and hug mom and dad for a while,
Yes.
or friends, but especially mom and dad.
Yeah, so just the distancing, right? Yeah, not being able to
The physical touch.
Yes.
Because we stood outside their apartment and talked to them from the floor, and they were in their balcony, but we didn't touch. Or even when I dropped things off, I'd go in their apartment and we wouldn't touch for a while. So
Yeah, that's tough. Okay, yes, Marcia.
well, I'm a real people person, so I missed interaction with other people, things that I did, groups, Bible studies, things like that, became non-existent. So just being here was the worst part of it. Sometimes I don't like my own company.
Yes, yes, I understand.
I think
saw-
the hardest thing for me was not being able to go to church and be around my church family. And
Yes.
that was, and around my neighbors and everything. It was just, and even my family. It made it so difficult to be all by myself and not be able to really even communicate.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. At the top of my list would definitely be, not just the pre-recorded worship services, but preaching to an empty church. You don't realize how much you feed off of the energy.
Oh, yeah,
I still
Mhm.
felt that the spirit was there, but it just, it was draining, week after week after week. It was just very draining. So,
absolutely.
yes, Sally.
Well, ditto to all of that. And with our family being so far away and in early on not being able to either get in the car and drive, knowing that when you stopped at gas stations to use the restroom or to get gas, you were putting yourself at risk and all of that. Definitely when I would get there to where my mother was, not to be able to then even hug her, like Carol had said about her parents, and not to be even in her presence, just to talk outside her window. And of course, all the grandchildren as well, and having to put that all off. So for me too, like Marcia, I'm definitely a people person, and not just being able to get out and be with friends and have a lunch with them or whatever. It was heartbreaking for sure.
Yes. Yeah, I can honestly say I cried. I cried when I heard the stories of people's loved ones being in the hospital and not being able to be there. And so they were camping out in their cars in the hospital parking lot just so that they could be near. And just, at the slightest of chance that they would be allowed to go in, they would be right there. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would have been like.
Right.
That's tough. So, anyone else? Yes, Jim.
Prior to the quarantine, I was an interim pastor down at Grace Presbyterian Church in Plano. And the quarantine started just as I finished that interim. I was there at a very difficult time in the life of the church, and Sally and I formed some close relationships with the people there during the transition to a more normal kind of church life. And the Sunday I left, the sanctuary was empty. I preached my last sermon to an empty sanctuary, and the associate pastor said goodbye to me to an empty sanctuary. And that sense of the loss of church family
Right.
was very difficult.
Yes. Yep. So the next question says, putting yourself in the rags of the leper, what specific response to your disease would be hardest to accept? So put your shoes in this leper. So yes, Jim.
I think for me, it would be rejection.
Yes. Indeed. One thing in this, the way he retold this story, when he has to go show himself to the priest, and his wife says, "Shall I go with you to tell the priest?" she asked. And he said, "No." I sighed, "I'll go alone." The shame, to me, I pick up on shame right away. And to know what is to come, there's lots of feelings, but there's shame in there too that, I'd rather just go alone because I know what the answer is going to be. Yes, Sally.
Yes, for me too, it's deep sorrow, and it's sorrow for the ones that I would love, and the hurt, the protectiveness that I would embrace, not wanting for them to be harmed. So this deep sorrow would be for my loved ones even though I would feel sad for myself if I was that leper, and the loneliness then that I was about to incur, but also knowing that I had this deep sorrow and somewhat fear for what effect that would have on my loved ones.
Yes, yeah.
Being able to be there to protect them, that I wouldn't be able to be there to love them or care for them.
Yeah. So were any of you fighting COVID within your households? Your immediate households? Okay. Thanks be to God for that, huh? But I can imagine that if someone in our, like, if I got COVID and, yeah, I could have, found a bedroom and stayed in there. But my worst fear would have been, to pass it on to someone else.
Right.
So you can imagine, that's the same thing of when you realize, he talks about how this slowly came on, and you can imagine him saying, please, Lord, don't let this be leprosy. You can just hear it in his voice. But then when you recognize it, in the belief that it was very contagious back then, you wanting to be a part of the family then, but you know what's coming. And so it's just a very, very tough place to be in. So yes, Carol.
Well, I was thinking more like in the modern day now, there are so many illnesses that people have that you can't see. And it's hard to accept when others don't see it and don't realize that you're hurting inside. So they don't know how to reach out to you, and you feel loneliness and rejection or whatever, whether it's a physical, emotional illness. There's so many that don't have sores anymore. So we still have those kinds of feelings, but it's just not the same kind of visual disease.
Right. Yes, Linda.
Is there a cure for leprosy now? Because I heard that the last island in Hawaii that was strictly for lepers.
That's on
is
Molokai.
closed.
That's on
Yes,
Molokai.
and right, I was going to say Molokai, and I thought, no, that's not right. But
Yes, it
yeah, I
is.
was close.
Yes.
But did they close because leprosy has been cured?
No, they still have lepers there because they don't want to go out into the other communities because they don't look right and they have a lot of mental feelings, but there's still a few left there.
Yeah.
I think it's called Hansen's.
Okay, I was hoping there was a cure.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a cure, but I know they're still there.
Yeah. Charles, what were you saying?
It's called Hansen's disease, and it is treatable.
Yep. So then we have this text on page 33 from Hebrews 14. It says, seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Now this is the new King James, so that confession is not confession of sin, but it's a confession of faith. So let us hold faith to what we believe, in other words. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So this is a wonderful question. It says, how have your quarantine experiences affected your thoughts and attitudes towards God? So how did being in quarantine affect your faith and your understanding of God? Yes, Sally.
Well, I would have to say very simply, God's got this. God's in control. And it's his timing, not mine. And the effects of it will be how he sees it. And he is empowering not just me, but all of us to be patient and to have a higher level of tolerance, perhaps. So I entrusted this in his care.
Yes. Yep. Peg, did you have a hand up?
I did.
Nola's here.
I know. Welcome, Nola.
I know.
Thank you. Thank you. I found that I had a much more personal and satisfying prayer life. Nothing was getting in my way. There was nothing that I had to do. There was nowhere I could be except where I was. And in that sense, it was a very good experience.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, Carol.
Well, I think even though we couldn't be together at church, it was probably more meaningful because there were less distractions. So your sermons were more thoughtful for me to think through. So I think in that way it was a deeper worship experience. But I mean, I always knew he's in charge, but it was just a different kind of worship experience, and a nice one temporarily.
Yes. Yeah.
Not permanently, but for temporary, it was good.
Yeah. Yeah. I just personally found myself having a lot more quiet time, and quiet time always breeds, for me at least, time with God and a listening ear. There's I forget what psalm it was, but there's a psalm that says, only you, oh God, can make the wounded whole. And that would kind of became my mantra a lot of times. Not just the wounded as in the sick, but whatever wounds that we were was being created through the coronavirus. Only you can make all of this right again. And so it was a sense of surrender. There was a lot of choices, hard choices sometimes that council had to make about what to do at church to keep everyone safe. And we talked openly about it, we prayed about it, but ultimately, we just said this is in God's hands, and God's timing is not often our timing. And so we just had to say, this is the reality that we're living in. And we just trek forward knowing that God's, as y'all said already, God's got this. So yes, Jim.
From my perspective, to some extent, when things are in God's hands, God transfers responsibility back to us. And I think my understanding was that God deals with us as individuals, but also puts us in a community context. And having compassion for those in the larger community means doing what we can to protect them from contagion, from getting the disease. And so God makes us responsible not just for our own well-being, but for the well-being of those around us. A lot, even though we're quarantined, we have a larger sense of community, a responsibility to the community.
So the second question says, based on the verses above, referencing the Hebrews 4 passage, how well does God understand what you are going through? It says, for we do not have a high priest. By the way, one of the main jobs of the high priest, of course, is to offer prayers, on our behalf, right? The high priest would always approach God on behalf of the community. So, if Jesus is our high priest, he is approaching the Father. We're going to talk about this in one of my promise keeping God things about how Jesus himself is praying on our behalf at the foot of the Father. Wrap your brain around that for a minute. But we have this high priest who is Jesus, one who can sympathize from what we are going through, and knowing the prayers that we actually need and offering that on behalf of the Father. So how well do you think God knows, or Jesus knows, what we're going through, what our weaknesses are, what our fears are? Yes, Marcia.
Well, if we use that adjective omniscient, he knows everything. That's what I feel. I feel he knows everything.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because the understanding of to know, God not only knows us, but the fact that he knows us, there's always action behind it. That love is a verb, as they say. So it's not just that God knows what we are going through, but God is always putting something into action. Maybe it's to bless us, maybe it's to challenge us, maybe it's to rub off the rough edges on our lives, whatever that might be. But it's not that just that God knows, but God is putting that knowledge into action on our behalf, and that's a powerful thing. The fact that, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was just thinking, even with all the suffering and death that was surrounding us at that time, God was still able to save us from the death of our hopes and our dreams, and from the loss of what we thought of what was stable and just the kind of that almost like the end of our lives. At times we felt very weary, but yet he was still able to be there and to save us.
Yes. When we were in seminary, and we were talking about, Jesus was fully human and fully divine as well. He's not half human and half divine, but he's fully human and fully divine at the same time. But we were talking about what that means, and my professor said, if you can't envision that Jesus got headaches, that he got food poisoning, that he got hangnails, you don't fully understand what Jesus, what it means by fully human. He experienced everything we did. Jesus was betrayed. People talk behind Jesus' back. We have all these stories within the biblical narrative. And he not only happened, but he felt the sting of that. When people talk bad about us behind our back, as they did with Jesus time and time again, it's not just a matter of acknowledging that, but it's acknowledging the sting and the hurt behind that, and to recognize that, Jesus experienced all of that, even though he was fully God at the same time. There had to be sickness, there had to be all of that within Jesus' life for him to fully understand. Jesus' death on a cross was just a horrific experience. When they drove the nails in his hands, he bled. He literally bled to death. And so he fully understood what it means to be human, the whole human experience. He entered it fully. And because of that, he fully understands what we go through. Yes, Charles.
One thing that you hear over and over again is how cut off people felt from others, be it our loved ones or just being able to talk with neighbors or whatever. And I think that in many ways, Jesus experiences that we very often turn our backs on God. We don't act as we should, and that has to hurt as well.
Mm-hmm.
What we do towards God.
Yeah, and sometimes just these experiences, like when there was all of the when no one was having toilet paper and all that other, food was hard to come by. I was always mindful, who needed those supplies, because the church had a lot of those supplies. Who has more than enough food that we can share. I was always mindful. I was always asking questions. I was always, I would ask that to people, do you have enough toilet paper? Do you have enough food? What can we do to help? And now that we're through that, I'm thinking, when is the last time I've asked someone, do you have everything that you need? So, I think that we should continue to ask those kinds of questions, to be mindful about the needs of other people. And it wasn't just needy people, it was all of us. All of us were experiencing times where we had plenty, and then other times we had to really, conserve what we had because we were running short and there were no more supplies. So I think that was another blessing about the whole quarantine, that we were very mindful about the needs of those around us. We got to know some of the neighbors that we lived, here in our neighborhood. We got to know some of our neighbors. We've been here, just shy of 20 years, and we had never really met some of the neighbors down the road. And we got to know them, and it's a blessing. But to keep those relationships going, I think can be an awesome thing. What other thoughts come to mind? Oh, yes, Sally, I'm sorry.
That's okay. My heart And my heart went out to parents and children and school children and teachers and the double duty that they all had to do with the Zooming of the lessons and in person, and then later part here and part there. And then, you know, stay-at-home mothers who were having to homeschool, and that whole idea of the balance of the homeschooling for my daughter and family was balanced with all the Girl Scouting and the Boy Scouting and the church activities and everything. And so it became all inclusive within the home itself. And then what effect that would have on children being isolated from their friends. So my heart really went out, especially to young parents and the children and teachers who dealt with the heavy burdens of balancing all of that.
Right.
So,
I hear a movie theme.
Yeah.
that's my husband's phone.
So name that movie. So
Yeah. But it's nice to see that those activities are beginning to resume, and activities with friends, and the kids can make those connections again.
yes.
Because it really is concerning for the emotional, social, and mental health of all of people, all involved.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I read a study about people, the kids who would have been in kindergarten last year, and how that's such a an important grade where they learn so much of the basics, and a lot of them didn't get those basics, and so how is that going to play in? We know they'll. I believe they'll catch up, and there's ways to allow them to continue to thrive. But it's a valid point, and it's something that we need to be mindful of, the school district. About where kids are. Yes, Marcia.
We had Timo up here for a week in February following Snowmageddon because his building wasn't ready to reopen yet. And so they went back to online school. He had started kindergarten online. And then in October, he went into the building. And then they had somebody who came in close contact with the children who tested positive for COVID. So they had 2 weeks off home with the online schooling, and Kenlyn took 2 weeks off and stayed home and did that with them. And then we had Snowmageddon, and then the building wasn't ready to open. So we said, well, we'll come and get him, and he can come up here and Grammy will do school with him. And we did really well, but it is hard. And I taught pre-K for 30 years, but what kids are expected to know at the end of their kindergarten year just blows my mind.
Right.
Yes.
I think the biggest word was digraph. They have to know all. We used to call them blends. Now they're called digraphs. And we would be online for an hour with the teacher, and then we'd be offline because we had homework or whatever you want to call it to prepare, and then we'd be back online, and then we'd get more homework, and it was back and forth all day. And it was good for us to do it together. I really enjoyed it, but for both the parents and the teachers, it takes a lot of intensive energy.
Yes, for
Yes.
sure.
Yeah. Yes, Nola.
I'm going to change the subject a little bit. I think that one of the things that I especially saw during this, well, two of the things. One of the things was that we had the TV that we did not have when I was a child, and we could keep up with what was going on all over the world. And I think another thing that really struck me one day was that when I was growing up, we did not call people on the telephone unless it was something important. And I think that during all of this COVID, I've never talked on the telephone as much as I did during these past months and year, but it kept people in touch with each other. And where normally I wouldn't have known anything about friends of mine that don't live right here, but friends that live all over the country, but I kept up with them not only the TV, but through the telephone and use of that. And I think it gave me not only a picture of what's happening here, but what's happening all around the country. I have kids that live in Connecticut and California, grandkids in Massachusetts, and you not only knew what was going on here with the people here, but you also knew what was going on all over the country and really all over the world with the television.
Mhm. Good point. Yes. Well, why don't we close with prayer? Oh God, teach us to come boldly to your throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find help in our times of need. And all God's people said, Amen.
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 So you may be wondering, what's the end of this story? Well, that's going to be next week. That's day 8. We continue with this story and what Jesus is going to do and say. It's a marvelous story, and we can continue to talk about it. So thank you all for being here. Have a great week.